Hi, everyone. Here today to talk about the next part of the warfare unit that we'll be studying, which has to do with American imperialism. And I sort of jokingly give it a subtitle, Manifest Destiny on Steroids. Obviously, if you pay any attention to the news with baseball or any other sports like Lance Armstrong, when you take steroids, it improves your performance. That's why they're illegal in most sports. But in this case, we see imperialism as a more severe, more strong version of Manifest Destiny. And there's going to be a lot of connections between the Manifest Destiny things we talked about prior to our short diversion into the Civil War and this section on imperialism. So I want you to look for those parallels and similarities as we go through this presentation. Manifest Destiny, as we talked about before the Civil War unit, it takes a time out in the 1850s and 1860s when the country really gets obsessed with the question of slavery and then fights the Civil War to get rid of slavery in the country. So expansion kind of takes a break. And after the Civil War is over and the country has rebuilt itself, there's this period of reconstruction in the South through the 1770s. The country has new energy and new interest in expansionism. And I want to point out that the United States is not the only country in the world that's going through this expansion period in this time period. In fact, we're one of the last countries, last European Western countries to do so. Britain, France, Germany, Belgium, Spain, Italy, all are gaining colonies in Africa, in Asia, in the islands, in the Pacific. And the U.S. does get into this imperial time period. It just gets into it a little bit later than most of the other countries. This is where this word imperial comes from. If you look at the word imperialism, you see it's a little bit of a stretch, but you can see the word empire in there. Imperial is the adjective form of the word empire. Excuse me. And what that means is that imperialism is really empirism. It's about acquiring an overseas empire. So the definition that I use for imperialism is controlling overseas colonies by force. America will go through a new period of expansion after the Civil War that we call imperialism, or the imperial period. But we've already expanded from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean. So now we have to look for colonies elsewhere, in other parts of the Western Hemisphere, not specifically connected to our continental United States. If you look at this political cartoon, which if you just sort of glance at it, looks like a map of the United States, in reality, it's a cartoon drawn to look like Uncle Sam's face, a symbolic representation of the United States. And if you notice, Uncle Sam here is trying to eat what could be the island of Cuba, but in this case looks like a little fish. This is not coincidental. It's drawn to show that the United States is about to acquire Cuba, which, as we'll see, is an important part of this imperial period. The first example of imperialism, it almost doesn't fit as an example, but I included it anyway so we could talk about it. Alaska, until the 1860s, was controlled by Russia. It was part of Russia's empire. And Russia in the 1860s is going through a whole series of crises. Their czar is assassinated. They're in the process of reshaping their economy to be more open and Western. And Russia realizes that it doesn't have a lot of use for Alaska. So they approach the United States about America buying it. And we're in the middle of a civil war. Most people didn't think that this was a good investment, but the Secretary of State at the time whose name was Seward makes the decision that, yes, we want to buy Alaska. And America gets it at a very, very cheap price. Seward is mocked. Lincoln is made fun of during this time period for approving this sale because most people see Alaska as just a big frozen nothing, getting a bunch of land that really doesn't have very much use. Obviously, so that's why it's called Seward's Folly. Obviously, today, Alaska has a ton of use. It's a place of immense natural resources, including lots of oil, natural gas, and other, timber, fishing. So it's a very valuable piece of land, even though it's really cold there most of the year. But that land is, at the time it was made fun of, but now we see its value. This is the first example of American expansion. It sort of doesn't fit the imperial period because of the timing. It's during the Civil War. But you can see that even as the Civil War is going on, America's looking for new ways to expand its territory and to gain new land. This opportunity came during the Civil War, and Seward jumped up on it. The second example is a little bit more appropriate and a little bit more confusing, and this example is Hawaii. Prior to 1870, Hawaii was an independent country. It had its own queen and king, royal family, was relatively isolated given its location in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. By the 1870s, Hawaii has begun to trade with other countries, particularly the United States, and many American sugar companies find that Hawaii is a wonderful place. Sugar, as we've talked about before, is a very valuable commodity in this time period because people are eating more and more of it in their diet, so there's an increasing demand for sugar. Sugar is an incredibly difficult crop to grow. It's very, very labor intensive. So if you look at that picture, the guys in this picture are harvesting sugar cane, which is where the primary source where sugar comes from. Sugar cane only grows in extremely warm climates. When it grows, you have to literally go into the fields with machetes to cut the sugar cane. It's a very difficult job because you have to be hunched over, swinging machetes with other people around swinging machetes. That could be very dangerous. There's lots of bugs and rats around because as you cut the sugar cane, the sweetness, syrupy substance inside the sugar cane leaks out. Then you have to split the sugar cane, you have to scrape out the insides, process that into sugar. It's a very labor-intensive process. But Hawaii was a great place to do it because Hawaii is a very tropical climate. Also a great place to grow things like bananas and other citrus fruits, things that were increasingly in demand in the United States. So our companies are going and getting a larger and larger influence in the Hawaiian economy. Eventually, the Queen of Hawaii, by this point we're in the 1880s, whose name is Queen Liliuokalani, and you can see her picture there on the right. She wants to limit the expansion of the United States into her territory. She sees what's happening, that these corporations and wealthy American businessmen are coming in and taking too much control over her society. So she passes some laws to try to limit their power. This is resisted by these wealthy businessmen who take away the power of the queen, essentially depose her, and institute a group of wealthy white men to take control of Hawaii. That happens around the year 1894. And then in 1898, Hawaii will be officially annexed into the United States as a territory. So there's this 15-year process through which Hawaii goes from being an independent nation with its own royal family to Hawaii becoming a territory in the United States. And this largely happens because of our desire to get resources out of Hawaii, particularly sugar and other tropical fruits. The third example that we have of American imperialism is the Spanish-American War. This is sort of the biggest example. As we talked about during Manifest Destiny, there were many people, particularly in the South, who viewed Spanish territory in the Caribbean Sea as something that America should get its hands on. Spain controlled Puerto Rico and Cuba particularly in this time period, and Cuba had always been something that Americans had a lot of interest in acquiring. Well, Cuba in 1898 is fighting a rebellion against Spain. Spain was not a very good colonial power. It still had slavery until much later than the United States in Cuba, and the Cuban people were in the process of fighting a revolution to kick out the Spanish. We viewed this as our opportunity, and there was a lot of conversation about how the U.S. needed to get involved to protect the Cubans, to help them, etc. President McKinley, in 1898, sends the USS Maine, which is a ship, U.S. Navy ship, to the harbor in Havana, Cuba. That ship explodes, as the illustration on the right demonstrates. There are 3 or 4 possibilities as to why the ship exploded. It's quite possible that the ship just exploded by accident. Ships in this time period were fueled by coal, so you had these very hot engines in the middle of the ship and then huge storage rooms of coal. If fire gets into the coal room, it's going to explode. So that was one possibility. A second possibility was that the Spanish actually blew it up. that the Spanish, for some reason, were threatened by the United States presence, and that they put a bomb in the ship and blew it up, and that was why the 200 Americans were killed. It's also possible that the Cubans blew it up, thinking that we would blame Spain for the explosion. The fourth possibility is that we blew it up ourselves in order to have a reason to start the war with the Spanish. Historians have debated this topic since it happened. There was a large commission. The commission said that the explosion came from the outside of the ship, but there's reasons to suspect that that might not be the case. Anyway, we don't really know why the ship blew up. We'll probably never know for sure why the ship blew up. But the important piece is that when the ship blows up, America blames Spain and says that Spain killed our sailors in Havana, Cuba in 1898. And this becomes the reason why the war begins. This war against Spain is relatively quick and relatively painless. Teddy Roosevelt, who's pictured there in the middle of that group of men in the image to your left, Teddy Roosevelt is a Harvard student, famous American wealthy family member, and he leads a group of soldiers that he calls the Rough Riders up San Juan Hill in probably the war's most important battle. The U.S. will rout the Spanish relatively quickly, and when the war is over, America will gain Puerto Rico, which we still control today as a territory. America will gain the Philippines, which is very odd. We'll talk more about that in a few minutes. But Philippines was part of Spain's empire, and America did attack it during the war, and thus Philippines become part of our country directly. And we don't gain Cuba, but we had the option to. There was a lot of talk about how America would look greedy if they had taken over Cuba directly. So the United States makes Cuba a protectorate. You can see the word protect in protectorate. Cuba was technically an independent country, but there were lots of rules and regulations put on Cuba, and if we didn't like what the Cuban government was doing, we could get involved and manipulate it. This made the Cubans very resentful and will lead to larger problems with Cuba during the Cold War that we'll talk about in a couple weeks. The Filipinos were not thrilled about the prospect of becoming part of the United States. Like Cuba, the Filipinos had been fighting against Spain, trying to become an independent country. And when the United States kicks out the Spanish and says, hey, now we're in charge here, the Filipinos feel like they want to win their independence and not be a colony of the United States. The leader of the Filipinos in this fight is a man named Emilio Aguinaldo, and he leads some of the Filipino people in a rebellion against the United States. This is a war that we don't learn too much about in American history normally. It's a war that kills approximately 200,000 Filipinos. But the United States will fight after the Spanish-American War using our Marines to recapture and control the Philippines. And we'll be spending more time in class talking about this, but just know that the war with the Filipinos for us to conquer and capture the Philippines is a big aftermath of the Spanish-American War. Obviously, the Philippines was a very valuable piece of territory for the United States because of its proximity to places like China and Southeast Asia and Japan. If we controlled the Philippines, we could control the trading routes to and from the Philippines, which was a very valuable thing for the United States and could potentially really improve our trade. That's why we wanted it, even though it was so far away from the rest of the Western Hemisphere and the mainland United States. We should point out that not all Americans thought that our expansion, thought that the Spanish-American War was a particularly good idea. There are many Americans who form groups, including the Anti-Imperialism League, that speak out against expansion. There's a couple of reasons for this. Some of these people speak out against it because they don't think that America is acting in a just way, that taking over other countries in order to improve our trading circumstances is not the right thing to do. They see it as violating our own Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, et cetera, et cetera. There are other Americans who object to it on other grounds, mostly racial and racist grounds. They're concerned that if we take lots of non-white people into our country, that will make the country quote unquote less American. So you get lots of people speaking out against imperialism for a variety of reasons. Some are speaking out against it because they don't want Filipinos to be American citizens or don't want Cubans to be American citizens. Some people are speaking out against it because they don't want America to be taking advantage of people in other parts of the world just for their own economic gain. This is important because it leads to a sense of isolationism growing in the United States. Again, you can see the word isolate. Isolationism is the idea that we don't want to be involved in foreign affairs, that we don't want to engage in lots of activities outside of the United States. As the cartoon shows, maybe we should just build a wall and stay inside and focus on our own country, our own people, and our own problems. Isolationism will be really important because during both World War I and World War II, the United States is late to the game. We're not really that involved in the early stages of either war, in part because there are large groups of people in the United States who are saying, no trade, no imperialism, let's focus on our own problems. So this isolationism topic is important and will come up again as we discuss the next two wars. The fourth example of imperialism during this time period is called the Roosevelt Corollary. If you remember, during the Manifest Destiny period, President Monroe comes up with the Monroe Doctrine, stating that the United States is going to, quote unquote, protect the countries in Central and South America from European intervention. One of the problems that was coming up in the early 1900s when Teddy Roosevelt became president was that many countries in Central and South America, particularly places like Venezuela, Colombia, countries in Central America, they owed large amounts of money to European countries. In fact, Venezuela in 1902 is almost attacked by the Germans, who are trying to invade the country to take back money that is owed to them. Teddy Roosevelt saw this as a big problem. He's concerned that European countries will come in and just start attacking random European countries in order to get the money that's owed to them. So the Roosevelt Corollary says that the United States will intervene in these countries for the Europeans to make them pay their debts. This way we can get the Europeans the money that they want, and we can keep militaries from France, Germany, Britain, out of the Western Hemisphere. From this Roosevelt Corollary, Teddy Roosevelt, and you'll see him in many of the cartoons we look at, gets the slogan, "Speak softly and carry a big stick." Teddy Roosevelt is a man of action, not necessarily a man of words. And he is very focused on using America's military power to get other countries in the Western Hemisphere to do the things that we want. This sets off a very the first 30 years of the 20th century, the U.S. is involved in a number of conflicts in Central and South America. We invade Haiti several times. We invade the Dominican Republic. We invade Nicaragua. We invade Mexico. All of these are conflicts where we're trying to control what goes on in these other countries. In some ways, we're trying to help them. In many ways, we're trying to control them, manipulate them to get them to do the things that we want. And that becomes a major bone of contention between the United States and these countries going forward. The final example of imperialism that we're going to talk about is the idea of the Panama Canal. We tend to take the Panama Canal for granted today, but prior to the construction of a canal across between the Atlantic Ocean and the Pacific Ocean, the only way to trade and ship things completely by sea was to go all the way around the southern tip of South America. That took forever and was incredibly expensive and time-consuming. And everyone knew that you needed to build a canal that cut through the narrow parts of Central America so that you could improve shipping and get just generally large amounts of economic growth. And the place that was best to do this was the Isthmus of Panama. If you don't remember from 7th grade, an isthmus is a small strip of land between two larger bodies of water. In Panama, the land bridge gets as small as about 20 miles wide. So this was the ideal place to build a canal. The problem is that Panama didn't exist in the 1800s and early 1900s. It was part of the country of Colombia. And even though part of the canal had been built by a group of Frenchmen and then they went bankrupt, Colombia was very leery about letting the United States come in to work on building this canal. You can understand why. because of all the things that we previously talked about and how they fear that the United States is going to manipulate Colombia and take all this territory over. So, with the support of Teddy Roosevelt, the United States supports the Panamanians in their civil war against Colombia. And it's a very sort of long and complicated process, but in the end, Panama will become an independent country with the support of the United States. And as soon as Panama becomes an independent country, they give the United States the Panama Canal Zone, which is the land necessary to build the canal. If you were in the Panama Canal Zone between 1906 and 1979, you were in the United States of America. It was American territory. We built the Panama Canal. In 1979, we gave it back. If you look at this map, you can see Panama is in green, and you can see how narrow the land bridge gets during in this part of the Americas. That was where the canal was built, and that Panama becomes an independent country only when we help it to split off from Colombia. Again, we're looking out for our best interests, not that Panama shouldn't be an independent country, but that we get involved in a domestic dispute in Colombia in order to advance our own interests. This has long-term major benefits for the United States. Almost everything you own that come from China was shipped through the Panama Canal. So our world would be very different if we did not have this Panama Canal today. But America builds it and acquires it under what we would consider less than ideal circumstances. And that's another legacy of this imperial period. You can see another political cartoon of Teddy Roosevelt with the big stick intervening in Panama. Okay, I want to just go through a couple of political cartoons. You can see this one called the Spanish Brute. Notice the way that the Spanish are depicted in this cartoon. The dehumanization of the Spanish, the way that this Spanish soldier is shown desecrating an American flag, that's what he's standing on, dripping blood because he's murdered these sailors from Spain, from the United States, shown as an ape, not even human. These are all examples of how the press sort of got Americans excited and whipped them to want to go to war with Spain, even though it's not clear at all that Spain was the one who blew up the USS Maine in Havana, Cuba. You can see this cartoon. If you've ever been to a white elephant gift exchange, you know that a white elephant is something that is a gift that you don't really want. It's not something that you need, but maybe somebody else would find value for it. So they're sort of silly, not very expensive gifts. Well, here, the white elephant of the Philippines, looking kind of bruised and battered, is tied to Uncle Sam, tied to the United States. You can see that Uncle Sam doesn't look really happy to have this white elephant. And the message here is that the U.S. got the Filipino islands, but what were we going to do with them? Did they really have a lot of value to the United States? That was something that was hotly debated, and we will discuss in class this week. The last thing I want to show you, or ask you, and have you think about, because this will be the topic of our next essay when we get around to writing it starting next week, is how does U.S. imperialism around 1900 compare to Manifest Destiny? So what do you see as similarities between our expansion in the pre-Civil War period and our expansion in the post-Civil War period? What do you see as the differences? How did imperialism just build on the ideas of Manifest Destiny, but how was it a completely different set of circumstances? This will be where we focus on for our next essay. So I want you to think about this. If you want to get a jump start on it, you can start to sort of make an outline, make a Venn diagram to look for the similarities and differences, because this will be what we focus on going forward before we move into our unit on World War I and World War II.